Hello again. As you know, I'm Eli, the computer guy, over here for Everyman IT. Today's class is Introduction to Linux. So this is the first class in the Linux track. In this class, we're going to try to give you an overview of the concepts that you have to understand before you actually start using Linux. So in this class today, we're not going to be using terminals or consoles or GUIs or any of that. I'm not going to be really showing you any commands. I'm going to be explaining to you all of the things that you have to understand before you decide to go out and actually start trying to use Linux. Linux has a lot of benefits, has a lot of good things, but it has a lot of things that can also catch you up. There's a lot of things that you may not think about that could cause you problems in the future. So this class today, we're going to talk about what Linux is, where Linux came from, and all of the fundamental concepts that you have to understand before you actually start building your own Linux servers and maintaining your own Linux systems. So if you give me a second, I'm going to put a few things together and we're going to get into the class Introduction to Linux. So the first thing that we have to talk about in this Introduction to Linux class is just about what Linux is and where Linux came from. So Linux is an operating system. For all of you that don't know what an operating system is, and for all of you that think you do but may have forgotten what an operating system is, basically the operating system is a software layer that is between your hardware and the software that you actually use to get something productive. So the operating system is what allows the software to talk to the hardware, to allow things to store information to hard drives, to send out print jobs to printers, etc. So basically, you know, if you're in a normal Windows environment, a Windows operating system, you have your hardware, you have the Windows operating system, and then you have Office, you know, Microsoft Office that sits on top of the operating system. Well, with Linux, Linux is an operating system that acts as an intermediary between the hardware and the software. The main thing that you just need to realize is that in the Linux world, the software that you're running is many times not the same type of software that you would run in the Windows world that you're used to. You know, desktop applications like Microsoft Office or Adobe Photoshop are not usually run in a Linux environment. Linux normally runs servers, so Apache, a web server or a database server or a virtualization server, etc. So basically the first thing is Linux is an operating system. Operating systems reside between the hardware and the software. It allows the software to be able to talk to the hardware. So the Linux operating system was created between 1991 to 1994 by this guy named Linus Torvalds. Basically, it was his little pet hobby project to create his own operating system. Now, the big thing with Linux is because it has an UX at the end, and because most of the commands that you use look a lot like Unix, people think that Linux is a type of Unix, and that is not the case. Unix is its own type of operating system. Linux is its own type of operating system. This guy, Linus, created from the ground up the entire Linux operating system. So there's a lot of confusion in the world. People think that Linux is a version of Unix, and that is not the case. It was completely written from the ground up by this guy Linus. The reason is he wanted to create an open source operating system for people to use. So back in the day, you know, before 1994, Unix, although Unix now is open source for the most part, back in the 90s it was not open source. If you wanted to use Unix, you had to pay somebody in order to use Unix. Microsoft Windows, of course, is Microsoft Windows. You've always had to pay to use Microsoft Windows. So basically, this guy Linus was a computer scientist, computer engineer. He wanted an operating system that was completely free because, you know, him and his buddies, they need operating systems in order to create the cooler stuff that they want to create. You know, programmers want to create programs. Well, if you have a free operating system, that makes it a lot easier to create programs than if, you know, you have to pay somebody to use an operating system. So he created Linux back in 1994. So the big thing to remember with Linux is an operating system. It's going to look different than Windows. It's going to look different than Mac, but it is an operating system. It was created in 1994, and like I say, it is not a derivative. Has nothing to do really with Unix. A lot of people think Linux and Unix, that Linux is a version of Unix. That's not the case. Linux is as different, well, it's as separate from Unix as it is from Microsoft Windows. It's entirely own little critter. Now, after Linus created Linux back in 1994, you know, it spent a lot of energy, a lot of time to create Linux, and by the time he was done, you know, he had this wonderful product that he wanted to give to the world, and he also wanted to stop working for a little bit. Well, I don't know if he wanted to stop working for a little bit, but he didn't want to do as much work. So what he did was he made his new operating system completely open source, and then that allowed everybody in the world, every computer geek, every computer scientist, to start playing with and changing the operating system as they saw fit. So Linus created the original Linux, and then he gave that to the world, and then people at Berkeley decided to start creating their own little version of Linux. You know, people in China started creating their own version of Linux. People in Brazil, Linux is huge in Brazil, they started to create their own type of Linux. So he created the entire operating system. He made the code, how he programmed it, open source, so anybody could see the code, and then he just gave it out for everybody to start playing with. This in turn created something called distros or distributions. So when you go out to download Linux, so you're really excited, you want a free operating system because everybody loves free, and Linux is more secure, as we'll talk about later. So you want to start playing with Linux. Well, the first thing that you're going to run into is what are called distros or distributions. These are the various versions that people have created over time of Linux. So originally in 1994 there was Linux. Well, then major companies and educational institutions and etc. decided they liked Linux, but they started creating their own versions. So now you have Red Hat Linux, which is a version of Linux. You have Ubuntu Linux, that's a version of Linux. You have Google Android, you know, that little smartphone operating system, that's a version of Linux. So basically a distribution is all the different versions of Linux that are out there. Now when you go to decide what distribution you're going to use, you're going to have to think about what you want your computer to do. With Linux, it is much more important that you understand what you want your computer to do before you install the operating system than it is with Microsoft. With Microsoft and Windows, you just install Microsoft Windows and then you can figure out what you want to do with the server later. With Linux, every distribution is built to do things in a certain way. So there's a version called Trustix Linux. Trustix Linux is considered the absolute most secure Linux out there. It's just a brick. You set that thing up, and as long as you don't do anything completely retarded, nobody can hack it, no viruses can get to it. It is just one solid, secure server. But you have to decide that you want a solid, secure server before you go out and find the distribution to install on the server. So if you want a computer that you're going to use some Office applications or you're going to surf the web, then you may want Ubuntu's desktop version. If you want a super secure computer, then you might want Trustix distribution. If you want something with enterprise level support, so you want to use Linux, but you want to know there's a call center out there to help you if necessary, you may decide to use Red Hat Linux. But you have to decide what type of Linux you're going to use or what you need your computer to do, and therefore what type of Linux you're going to use before you install Linux. Because that's the thing, is if you install Ubuntu Linux distribution on all your computers and then you decide you need enterprise support and you call Red Hat Linux, well, Red Hat Linux people don't support Ubuntu Linux. See how that all works? So the distributions, like I say, back in 1994, there was one Linux. Linux was Linux. All these people started playing around with Linux. They started creating their own versions of Linux. These became distributions. Every distribution does things its own way. Like I say, Trustix is very secure. There's something called DSL Linux. It's called Damn Small Linux. Linux can fit within, the entire operating system can fit within 53 megabytes. So basically, when the people that created the DSL distro, they just wanted a really small, fast distribution of Linux. So the main thing to understand is all these distributions do things differently. Some do things really good, some do things really poorly. You have to decide for your computer, when it's going into a production environment, what do you want that computer or that server to do, and then pick the distribution for it that will do whatever that is best. Okay, so now that we've talked about basically where Linux came from and distributions, the next thing that we need to talk about that's very, 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 very important is open source licensing. So of course at this point in time you've probably heard of open source software, and you are probably under the wrong idea that open source software is free software. This is not the case. We've talked about this in other licensing classes, but here, once we go into the Linux world, this has to get beat into your head. Open source software is not free software, and if you treat all open source software as if it is free, you are jeopardizing your career, you're jeopardizing your company. It's just bad legally. So I just want to go over just for a minute about open source software and the different ways that open source software vendors get paid. So that you understand, again, open source software is not free. It's not monetarily free. What open source software means is that whenever programmers sit down to create the code, they provide you with the code so that you can see how the program was written. Because, you know, in the programming world, programmers sit down, they write code, they throw the code through a compiler that shoots out ones and zeros on the other side. So basically all open source software means, all the very definition of open source software is that you are allowed to see the source code. You are allowed to see how the software was actually created. Now there's 4 different ways that these open source vendors get paid. Now the first one is the one, of course, we all like, love, and is just the bee's knees. The original MySQL model, so MySQL is an open source database, was that they gave away the software 100% for free. So whether you are for personal use, whether it's nonprofit, whether it is commercial, whether you are Travelocity or whether you are Amazon, you are allowed to use the MySQL database software absolutely and utterly for free. The reason is the MySQL business model stated that their idea was that they would give away all the software, and then when you needed help, then you would call them and then you would pay them stupid amounts of money to get support for the database that you're using. So basically you get the MySQL database for free, you see how powerful it is, and then you go, I need MySQL training. So you go to MySQL, you drop $3,000 for a week training, and that's how they get money. That's the first way that these vendors get paid. This is the one that everybody thinks all open source software is like, but it's not. So this is where it's all completely free. The software creators, the software vendors simply get paid for support on the product. The second way, and this is one that can get you into a whole hell of a lot of trouble, so pay attention with me on this one, is a lot of the open source software out there. Basically, the open source community, they want, technicians, geeks like us, to be able to play with the software, use it at home, use it in computer labs, and not have to worry about legal implications. Because, with Microsoft, even if you're playing around with the software in your computer lab, you may actually have licensing issues. And you may actually have licensing issues that you could get sued for, even though all you're trying to do is play around with the software so that you can understand how it'll work and so that you can sell more of Microsoft's products. But sometimes that actually goes against the licensing of the product. So the second way that open source vendors get paid is what they do is they say for personal or non-commercial use, it is absolutely and utterly free. As soon as you use it for commercial use, you have to pay money. So the idea is if you're a geek at home and you want to play around with the software, you can install it, you can play around with it, no problem at all. If you want to set up a computer lab, you're trying to figure out how the software works, you want to see, if it'll do what your company needs it to do, no problem at all. You have a complete license. The problem where you can get into, especially with a lot of technicians, is as soon as you take that server and you take it from the test lab and you screw it into a server rack in the production environment, so this is where the commercial business actually starts to use it. As soon as that happens, you now own a licensing fee. And sometimes these licensing fees can be anywhere between $50,000 to $10,000. So be very careful about this. Like I say, you're fine using it at home, you're fine using it in the computer lab, but as soon as you screw that thing into a server rack, then you need to pay money. And like I say, this is something that can really trip people up. The next way, of course, with open source software is that they sell it just like everybody sells software. So basically, you know, if you want the product, you pay them the licensing fee and you buy it. Just like if you were dealing with Adobe, just like if you're dealing with Microsoft or QuickBooks, you buy it. The difference with open source software in this model, where you just purchase the software outright, is again, you can still see the source code. So if you buy the Windows operating system or you buy QuickBooks, they are not going to give you the source code. They're not going to tell you how the software was written. Well, for a lot of enterprise companies, they want to see how the software was written. So basically, you buy the license outright and then you get to see the code. The one thing you have to be very careful about is, although you see the code, you have to understand what your rights are to the code, because this is copyrighted or patented or trademarked or whatever material. Although you're allowed to see the code, you may not have rights to modify the code. So you buy the software and you say, well, you know, I gave whatever SourceForge or whatever $10,000. I see the source code and oh, look, on line 400,050, I don't like what that line of code does. I'm going to remove that line of code and insert my own line of code. That may not be legal. That may be violating the license. So be very careful with that. And then the final way that these open source companies get paid, again, something you have to be very, very careful about, is that they give away the product for free. So you can download the server, you can download the desktop, you can download the appliance or whatever it is you're downloading. The issue is that the license states that in order to have the legal right to use the software, you have to pay a reoccurring contract. So let's say some of the Linux vendors, you can download their server software, their enterprise class server software for free. You can play around with it. It's amazing. But in order to actually use it, you have to pay anywhere between $100 to $1,000 a year in a support contract. When I was running Eli the Computer Guy, the repair shop, this is what killed our Linux aspirations back in the day, because I wanted to transfer clients over to Linux. At the time, like Red Hat was one of the prominent companies. We looked at that, and Red Hat required, I think it was like $250 a year in a subscription contract. So although you could download the software for free, although you could get it for free, you could install it on the computers, there was no activation process. You still had to pay an amount of money every single year to keep that server within licensing compliance. So again, you know, here at Everyman IT, we're not just, you know, trying to teach you how to do programming or how to set up servers. You know, I want you to either be a consultant or be in the decision-making process. And, you know, as I say in a lot of classes and my podcasts, these kind of decisions, how open source licensing works, is far more important to your business or to your enterprise than simply, you know, being able to set up a server. You know, this is the kind of stuff that can cause massive amounts of damage to your company. If you install 20 servers and you don't understand the licensing requirements, and those are your mission critical systems, if you have to switch those servers over to something else, I mean, that may be a catastrophic problem. So understand, open source does not mean free. It has nothing to do with free. A huge amount of open source software happens to be free. That doesn't mean open source software is free. What open source means is that you are allowed to see the source code that created the program. This doesn't mean you're allowed to modify the source code. You may not be able to do a damn thing to the source code, but at least you are allowed to see the source code so that you understand what is happening. So if there are flaws, if there are security holes, etc., you can actually see that in the code. So again, you know, the ways open source licensing works is it can either be completely free and you simply pay the software creator for support, It can be free for personal and non-commercial use, but as soon as you put it into a commercial environment, you have to pay. Again, this is one of the things that can trip you up, because in your computer lab, you may create the entire system, the entire setup. You know, that server is working 100% A-OK, and you may not think about it. You may just pick up that server and slot it into a rack and not realize you have to write a check to somebody. So be very careful about that. The third way, again, is that the creator actually sells you the program, just like Microsoft or QuickBooks or Adobe. The difference is you're allowed to see the source code. The one thing you have to be careful with here is, again, if you are a programmer, or if your company has programmers, although you can see the source code, you may not have rights to modify anything in the source code, and that's something that you have to be very careful about. And then finally, again, this is something that can trip you up. You can download the software, you can install it, everything's A-OK, except to be compliant with the licensing agreement, you may have to have a reoccurring maintenance contract. Again, like I say, in a Linux world, Linux goes from being really affordable to being really stupidly expensive that quick. And these maintenance contracts are one of the things that can make it very expensive. You know, you install all these servers, and then all of a sudden you're paying $250 a year. Every single year that server is up and running. You know, even with Windows Server 2008, you pay, let's say, $600, and you own the software. That could end up being cheaper for a server that's going to be running for 5 to 10 years. So something to think about. So this is the open source licensing. Like I say, this is the kind of stuff that will make or break your career. So make sure you take it seriously. So now that we've gone through the legalese, now we need to talk about the shell of the operating system, to make sure you understand what the shell of the operating system is, because again, this is something that a lot of people don't think about, and then it can cause them problems. So the shell of the operating system is the screen that you use to interact with the operating system. So if you're thinking about the Windows shell, you know, if you have Windows 7, the Windows shell is that graphical user interface where you have a little mouse and you go around and you can click on pictures on the on your desktop. So you have a desktop, you have folders, you double click on a folder and it opens up. So that is a shell. That is called a GUI shell, GUI, graphical user interface. There are also things called LUI shells, line user interfaces. Now these look basically like DOS prompts. So if you ever play with DOS, or if you ever went into a DOS prompt, a line user interface is that. So you type in a command and you hit enter, and then you get some words or garbage out the other side. In Linux, the thing that you have to understand about this shell is in Linux, since this is more of a computer scientist, geeky operating system, or the people that use the operating system are more computer science, geeky people, they prefer to use the LUI, the line user interface. So basically that DOS prompt. So when you go in to Linux, you can install Linux so that you either have a graphical component, so you open it up and you have little folders to click, etc., or that you just have that little line user interface. So you have to type in change directory or make directory or etc. The main thing, again, that you just have to remember with the shell is the screen that you use to interact with the operating system. It can be line user interface, or it can be a graphical user interface. In Linux, they prefer the line user interface, and the line user interface is much more powerful than the graphical user interface in the Linux world. The thing is when you install Linux into a line user interface, all you're going to get is a prompt. So if you don't know what you need to do, you're kind of stuck. I had a lot of clients who did this, where they wanted to play and use Linux, and so they would install Linux, and then they would just get this flashing cursor. And since they didn't know any commands, they didn't know what to do. So basically that's the thing with the Linux and the line user interface, is you're going to have to understand the commands in order to get the computer to do anything that you need it to do. But the shell, again, the shell is a screen that you use to interact with the operating system, and like I say, this whole track is going to be about how to administer and manage Linux. Now the next biggest concept that you have to understand when you're going to be using Linux is the concept of root. Root is probably the biggest or one of the biggest concepts with Linux. So root means the highest level of anything. So when you hear about the root user is like in the Microsoft Windows world, is the administrator for the computer. The root user is the highest level user that you can be on the computer. So if you can log in as root, you can do anything in the world you want to with a computer. So root, if they say log in as root, the actual username is root. You log in and you are now logged in as the highest level user for the computer. Root can also mean the root of the operating system. So where is the operating system installed? The highest level that the operating system is installed at. So they could say the root of the operating system. And the root of the operating system might be C:\\. So that is the root. Root can also mean the highest level that a user can get into. So in Linux, users have home folders, right? So the home folder holds, all of their stuff, application settings, documents, pictures, all that kind of stuff. So the root of the user would be their home directory. The home directory is the highest level for the user. So the main thing to understand is whenever you're talking about root in Linux, root is the highest level of anything. If you're talking about the root user, well, there's actually a user account called root, and that user account is the absolute highest level user that you can be in the operating system. The root can do anything. If you're talking about the computer or the operating system, the root of the operating system is where the operating system is stored. So the highest level where the operating system is stored. Or the root of the user is, like I say, with user accounts, when you create them, they have a home folder that's created. So the root of the user would be home. So again, root is the highest level of anything. Just keep that in mind because, like I say, once we go into actually starting to type and do stuff in Linux, this concept of root is going to be very important. Okay, now we have to talk about something that just screws with everybody's head who has ever dealt with Windows when they go to the Linux world. And that is capitalization in the Linux world. So basically, you have uppercase letters and you have lowercase letters, right? Uppercase L, lowercase l. Well, in the Windows world, Windows doesn't care if you put it in an uppercase or a lowercase. So if you have a folder named home, uppercase H, lowercase, that is the same as this, which is the same as this, which is the same as this in the Windows world. Windows, except for when it comes to passwords, doesn't care about capitalization. So this home is the same as this home, as the same as this home, as the same as this home. Windows does not care. Here's the issue. In the Linux world, remember, Linux was created by and basically for computer professionals, computer scientists, computer engineers, etc. And you see these letters are coded in something called ASCII text. So this is all something called ASCII text. Well, in ASCII text, an uppercase H or an uppercase letter is actually a different character than a lowercase letter. So an uppercase H is a different character than a lowercase h. What this means is that in the Linux world, these would all be considered different folders. So if you have a folder and you call it home, uppercase H, lowercase O-M-E, that is a different folder in the Linux world than this, which is a different folder than this, which is a different folder than this. In Windows, these are all the same folders. In Linux, these are all different folders. So if you go, do a change directory and you have a folder named home with an uppercase H, but I don't know, for some reason you type in this, it will not be able to find that folder because this folder does not exist. This folder does exist. So basically in the Linux world, capitalization matters. An uppercase letter is different, and it actually is different in how it is encoded than a lowercase letter. So this, if these are folders, this is a different folder than this, which is a different folder than this, which is a different folder than this. One of the places this can cause you a lot of problems, and you've probably already seen this with some of the websites you use, is this also is true of your username login. So you know your username. So you're used to putting in your username and your password, right? And again, if you put in uppercase user, uppercase all user, lowercase user, those all work. So whatever your username is, you're used to being able to just type it in willy-nilly as long as it has the right letters in it. Again, in the Linux world, capitalization matters. So again, this user name would be different than this username, which would be different than this username, which would be different than this username. So in the Linux world, all these usernames would be different because they use different capitalization. So remember that for Linux. Linux, I mean, it's not complicated. It's just so people are so used to the Windows world where capitalization doesn't matter. But in Linux, it does. So capitalization matters. If you type in a username all uppercase in order to log in, you're going to have to use all uppercase in order to log in. Pretty simple stuff. Just remember, capitalization is absolutely and utterly important in the Linux world. Okay, so we've talked about where Linux came from. It was created back in '94. We've talked about distributions. These are all the different little versions of Linux that are running around. We've talked about the whole open source question. You know, how much is it going to cost you to use this free software, or is it really free? We've talked about the shell, the root. We've talked about capitalization. Capitalization is a huge thing. Remember, uppercase home is different than lowercase home. Now, you know, you're getting excited, and so probably before the next class, when I start showing you how to install Linux, you may run out there and decide, I'm going to download Linux and I'm going to start installing and playing with it. Well, I want to give you a warning about the two, generally, the different versions of Linux that almost everybody is going to provide. So whether you go to Red Hat, whether you go to Ubuntu, DSL, you know, whatever distribution is out there, they're normally going to have two versions of the distribution. One is going to be the server version. The other is going to be the desktop version. So you know, you guys are IT guys. You want to be, you're aspiring geeks, and you say, I don't want the desktop version. I want the server version. That might be a mistake, at least at this point in the game. The main difference between the server versions and the desktop versions of any of these Linux operating systems is that the server version is a stripped down version of the Linux, because they figure if you're going to be installing a server, you know what you want installed on the server. So there will be no graphical user interface. A lot of the tools that you use to administer Linux will not be installed automatically, because they figure if you want the tool and you're installing server, then you know how to install the tool. So the server version of almost any Linux distribution is the stripped down version. This has no graphical user interface. All you get is that little DOS prompt. Like I say, a lot of the tools that you will use to administer the server are not automatically installed, because again, they figure that if you know what you need, that you will install it. You are probably better off at this point in time to download the desktop version. The desktop versions of these distributions give you the graphical user interface right off the bat. So you install the desktop version and you have the graphical interface. So you have something that it looks like Windows or it looks like Mac. You know, you have a desktop, you have folders, you can right click, you can left click, you can double click. Basically, although it is different, you know, as the ties say, same but different. It functions differently, and you are going to have to learn how to use Linux. But it's an environment that you are probably going to understand as soon as you boot into it. So that's the main thing. The server, all you're going to get is a DOS prompt and the most minimal applications or utilities that the distribution needs to run. So anything anything basically you're going to need to use to actually manage a server, you're probably going to have to install as an additional application. Whereas with the desktop version, you're going to boot straight into a graphical environment. It's already going to have management tools installed, and you can play around and you can figure out how to use that graphical environment. So those are the two versions. Like I say, whether you're using Ubuntu, Red Hat, SUSE, they almost all have a server and a desktop version. From me to you, download and install the desktop version first. Because like I say, if you install the server version, all you're going to get is a DOS prompt. And if you don't know what to do next, there's nothing to do. So now that I've been talking about Linux, you may be thinking, wow, this is really exciting. It's a free operating system as long as you get the right distribution. I'm just going to run out there. I'm going to install Linux, and all I'm going to use is Linux, and Linux is great. A lot of people, when Microsoft Vista or Windows Vista came out, there were so many problems. All the pundits were talking about everybody was going to go to Linux. Well, Linux is good for some things, pretty good for other things, and absolute crap for a whole bunch of stuff. Let me tell you, as a desktop operating system, Linux really is not up to speed. I've tried to use Linux as a desktop operating system, and even me, as a computer geek, it's a pain in the butt. It's a bit quirky. It freezes up and does weird stuff as bad as Windows 98 ever did. So as a desktop operating system, you can play around with it and it may be good for you. But be careful. Like I say, it can be really quirky as hell. I use, on my computers, Windows 7. The reason I use Windows 7 is I don't want to pay for a Mac, and Windows 7 is actually pretty good. It's very functional. It does what it needs to do. The reason I would say that you should learn Linux and start deploying Linux is for server functionality. Linux is incredibly rock solid. Once you install Linux, once you get through the quirks and you set up all the configurations, a Linux server will run till the CPU overheats. It will just run. The server that is running our website, Everyman IT, it's been up for 150 days continuously right now and does not need a reboot in any way. The only reboot that I did 150 days ago was for some maintenance. The way that the Linux operating system is built, it's not like Windows where it needs to get rebooted every Tuesday, or you have memory leaks and it just crashes. Linux, as long as you configure it properly, will just run, and it will just do its job day in, day out, day in, day out, day in, day out. So the reason I would say that you should look at deploying Linux for yourself or for your clients is for server functionality, whether it's Apache web servers, MySQL database servers, Xen virtualization servers, email servers, etc. When you set up a Linux server, that thing is rock solid and it will just keep running. You're not going to have the same problem you have with Windows, where you install Windows on a computer today and it works really great, but then you keep getting all these updates, and 2 years from now the computer is working slower because all the updates that Microsoft has delivered have actually decreased the performance of your computer. We saw this a lot with Windows XP. It's not the case with Linux. You install Linux and it is just going to be It's just going to be a brick. It's just going to keep doing what you configured it to do. So as long as you configured it properly, like I say, it'll be a rock and it'll just keep running until the actual electronics die. The warning that I will give you is, if you're learning Linux, please feel free to play with the desktop version of the operating system. Install it on your laptop, install it on your desktop. My honest opinion, I swear to God, I'm a computer guy, is that it's not up to snuff yet as an actual desktop operating system. When I installed it, when I've played with multiple versions, like I say, it was just quirky, it froze up. There were just stupid problems. So it's not in prime time for the desktop operating system. As a server, it's absolutely phenomenal. If you're going to be hosting websites, definitely an Apache web server is a great thing, MySQL, etc. So Linux is great for servers, kind of crappy for the desktop. So I would suggest, just one geek to another, really think about using Linux, like again, for the server functionality. So that was a class introduction to Linux. We didn't show you any commands, or we didn't show you any of that kind of stuff today, because the most important thing right now is that you have a good foundation and understand where Linux came from, and then just some of the basic concepts about it. We talked about Linus Torvalds, who created Linux between 1991 to 1994. We talked about the very important thing. He created Linux from scratch. Linux is not a derivative of Unix. Linux has nothing to do with Unix. A lot of people think that like Linux is some kind of weird version of Unix. It is not the case. Linux is its own kettle of fish. The reason people think that Linux and Unix are similar is simply because when he was coding Linux, he made it so most of the commands that work in Unix will work in Linux. So you type in the same commands. What happens after you type in the command might be different, but you type in the same commands that you would in Unix. But Linux and Unix are different. Again, after 1994, he released Linux to the world. So everybody could use it, everybody could play with it, everybody could do whatever it is they wanted to do with it. So all these computer science geeks, you go out for dates and you go to the movies and I don't know, you go play golf. Well, these computer science geeks, they go home and program operating systems. So they found this wonderful Linux operating system. Linus really had done a good job, and so they started creating their own versions of Linux, depending on what they wanted it to do. Some people wanted it to be more secure, some people wanted it to be faster, some people wanted to use it for web servers, etc. This is where distributions came from, or distros. So distros, or distributions, are simply different versions of Linux. Some of the distros are very similar. Some of the distros have almost nothing to do with each other. So the main thing to understand is when you're thinking about deploying your server to do whatever it is you want it to do, the distro matters. If you install the wrong distribution of Linux, it may not be able to do what it is you want it to do best. So that's the distributions. We talked about open source. Again, this is a huge issue. We're trying to teach you how to be, more than simply the computer monkey, typing in commands. We're trying to teach you the thought process behind being real professionals. And real professionals need to understand licensing. When you go and you have a proposal for the executive, for the CEO, or for your boss, not only do you have to tell them what computers and hardware you need, but you also have to tell them licensing requirements. Open source licensing, again, all open source licensing means is you're allowed to see the source code. It doesn't mean that it is free. Open source has nothing to do with free. We talked about the shell. So the shell is the interface you use to interact with the computer. So in the Windows world, you are used to using a GUI shell, a graphical user interface. You have files and folders, and you double click and right click, and you get beeps and all that kind of stuff. There's also the LUI, the line user interface. This is what you would associate as a DOS prompt. The main thing to remember in the Linux world is, again, created by computer people, computer scientists and computer engineers. They prefer to use the line user interface, where you actually have to type in commands. Where, we've talked about this can cause real problems is most of the time if you download the server version of any Linux distribution, you don't get the graphical user interface automatically when you download it. So you install the server version and all you get is a little blinking cursor at the end. And if you know the commands to do what it is you need to do, it'll work. If you don't know what the commands are, you're kind of stuck. I talked about root. So root is the highest level of anything in Linux. So the root user is the highest level user in a Linux computer. The root user can do anything it wants to the Linux computer. The root of the folder, or the root of the operating system, is where the operating system is installed. So if they say go to the root of the operating system, you would go to whatever folder the operating system is installed in. The root of user accounts, in Linux, when you create user accounts, they get little folders, home folders, just like you get in Windows. So the root of the user account would be in that home folder. We talked about capitalization. Capitalization is a simple but huge issue in Linux. An uppercase H h is different than a lowercase h. So uppercase letters are different than lowercase letters. If you type in your username all uppercase when you are creating the account, and then when you try to log in, you type it in all lowercase, it is going to fail out. You are not going to be able to log in because the username is not correct. Because in the Linux world, it really is not correct. Remember, capitalization is a huge, huge, huge thing. Again, we talked about the server and desktop versions of Linux. The server version, the stripped down, the barest level of an operating system you can have. Again, you install it, you get a little blinking cursor, and very little is installed on that computer when you install the server operating system. Why? The people that create whatever Linux distribution you're dealing with figure if you're installing a server, you know what you want running on that system. So they give you the bare bones system so that you can install only what you need. The desktop version, whenever you download a desktop version, like I say, from Ubuntu or such, that will, you'll boot into a graphical user interface. You'll boot into something that, vaguely looks like Windows or the Mac operating system. You'll have files and folders in the desktop and little graphics and sounds and all of that. So, when you first start playing with Linux, I would suggest you download the desktop version. Again, when it boots up, you're going to get something that you're going to have a vague idea at least what to do with. If you download and install the server version, you just get a little blinking cursor, and that's it. I talked about what Linux is good for. Again, as I would say, for servers and security and such, it is amazing. Our server has just been running. Linux servers can go for years without a reboot. It is simply how they are built. Windows servers, they have to get rebooted every once in a while. They have to get all these updates, etc. Linux servers, they do actually have to get updates every once in a while, but most of the time they just run. They literally run until the hardware fails. The bad part with them is, though, like I say, I've used the desktop versions, the graphical user interfaces. I mean, they're not bad for things like data recovery computers or for computers that I use for appliances, within a repair shop. But I would not suggest the desktop versions for average users. And I sure as hell would not deploy it to average users. Again, they're a little buggy. They are different than Windows. So, you migrate users over to Linux. Linux is going to be a little buggy on you. It's going to be different. It's just going to be a pain in the butt. Like I say, my systems at home, they all run Windows 7. The reason is Windows 7 really is good. I can install and buy all the software that I need. And like I say, at the end of the day, it works very well. So Linux, like I say, you can go to the desktop route. That's your business. I would suggest, at least for your clients, it's awesome for servers. It's amazing for servers, whether you're dealing with LAMP, that means basically a web server, whether you're dealing with email servers, file servers, backup servers, etc. You really just can't ask for better. So that was a class, Introduction to Linux. These are all the basic concepts that you should understand before you start working on Linux. Our next class, we're going to be installing Linux. Then past that, we're going to do the basic utilities on Linux. Linux is easy. Again, as I say with almost all this stuff, it is easy if you take it step by step. If you buy one of those Linux Bibles that's about that big, and you try to figure out how to use Linux using one of those Bibles, it's going to seem like you need a PhD in order to use Linux. That's not the case. Linux really is pretty simple. You just have to chop it down into bite-sized pieces, and then once you understand those little bite-sized pieces, you go, wow, why haven't I been using Linux for servers for years? It really is true. As you know, I'm Eli, the computer guy, over here for Everyman IT. As always, it's been a real pleasure to teach this class, and look forward to seeing you at the next one.